The Everlasting Man, Part 5. One fact does certainly fall across us like a shadow. Our glimpses of both these early empires show that the first domestic relation had been complicated by something which was less human, but was often regarded as equally domestic. The dark giant called slavery had been called up like a genie and was laboring on gigantic works of brick and stone. Here again we must not too easily assume that what was backward was barbaric. In the matter of manumission, the earlier servitude seems in some ways more liberal than the latter. Perhaps more liberal than the servitude of the future. To ensure food for humanity by forcing part of it to work was after all a very human expedient, which is why it will probably be tried again. But in one sense there is a significance in the old slavery. It stands for one fundamental fact about all antiquity before Christ, something to be assumed from first to last. It is the insignificance of the individual before the state. It was as true of the most democratic city-state of Hellas as of any despotism in Babylon. It is one of the signs of this spirit that a whole class of individuals could be insignificant or even invisible. It must be normal, because it was needed for what we would now call a social service. Somebody said, "The man is nothing and the work is all," meaning it for a breezy Carlylean commonplace. It was the sinister motto of the heathen servile state. In that sense there is truth in the traditional vision of vast pillars and pyramids going up under those everlasting skies, forever by the labors of numberless and nameless men, toiling like ants and dying like flies, wiped out by their work of their own hands. But there are two other reasons for beginning with the two fixed points of Egypt and Babylon. For one thing, they are fixed in tradition as types of antiquity, and history without tradition is dead. Babylon still the burden of a nursery rhyme, and Egypt, with its enormous population of princesses awaiting reincarnation, is still the topic of an unnecessary number of novels. But a tradition is generally a truth, so long as the tradition is sufficiently popular, even if it is almost vulgar. And there is a significance in this Babylonian and Egyptian element in nursery rhymes and novels. Even the newspapers, normally so much behind the times, have already got as far as the reign of Tutankhamen. The first reason is full of the common sense of popular legend. It is the simple fact that we do not know more of these traditional things than any other contemporary things, and that we always did. All travelers from Herodotus to Lord Carnarvon followed this route. Scientific speculations of today do indeed spread out a map of the whole primitive world, with streams of racial emigration or admixture marked in dotted lines everywhere, over spaces which the unscientific medieval mapmaker would have been content to call terra incognita. if he did not fill the inviting blank with a picture of a dragon to indicate the probable reception given to pilgrims. But these speculations are only speculations at the best, and at the worst the dotted lines can be far more fabulous than the dragon. There is unfortunately one fallacy here into which it is very easy for men to fall, even those who are most intelligent, and perhaps especially those who are most imaginative. It is the fallacy of suppositing that because an idea is greater in the sense of larger, therefore it is greater in the sense of more fundamental and fixed and certain. If a man lives alone in a straw hut in the middle of Tibet, he may be told that he is living in the Chinese Empire, and the Chinese Empire is certainly a splendid and spacious and impressive thing. Or alternately, he may be told that he is living in the British Empire, and be duly impressed. But the curious thing is that in certain mental states he can feel much more certain about the Chinese Empire that he cannot see than about the straw hut which he can. He has some strange magical juggle in his mind, by which his argument begins with the empire, though his experience begins with the hut. Sometimes he goes mad and appears to be proving that a straw hut cannot exist in the domains of the dragon throne, that it is impossible for such a civilization as he enjoys to contain such a hovel as he inhabits. But his insanity arises from the intellectual slip of supposing that because China is a large and all-embracing hypothesis, therefore it is something more than a hypothesis. Now modern people are perpetually arguing in this way, and they extend it to things much less real and certain than the Chinese Empire. They seem to forget, for instance, that a man is not even certain of the solar system as he is certain of the South Downs. The solar system is a deduction, and doubtless a true deduction, but the point is that it is a very vast and far-reaching deduction, and therefore he forgets that it is a deduction at all and treats it as a first principle. He might discover that the whole calculation is a miscalculation, that the sun and stars and street lamps would look exactly the same. But he has forgotten that it is a calculation, and it is almost ready to contradict the sun if it does not fit into the solar system. If this is a fallacy, even in the case of facts pretty well ascertained, such as the solar system and the Chinese Empire, it is an even more devastating fallacy in connection with theories and other things that are not really ascertained at all. Thus history, especially prehistoric history, has a horrible habit of beginning with certain generalizations about races. I will not describe the disorder and misery this inversion has produced in modern politics, because the race is vaguely supposed to have produced the nation. Men talk as if the nation were something vaguer than the race, because they have themselves invented a reason to explain the result. They most certainly deny the result in order to justify the reason. They first treat a Celt as an axiom, and then treat an Irishman as an inference. And then they are surprised that a great fighting, roaring Irishman is angry at being treated as an inference. They cannot see that the Irish are Irish, whether or no they are Celtic, whether or no there were ever any Celts. And what misleads them, once more, is the size of the theory. the sense that the fancy is bigger than the fact. A great scattered Celtic race is supposed to contain the Irish. So of course the Irish must depend for their very existence upon it. The same confusion, of course, has eliminated the English and the Germans by swamping them in the Teutonic race. And some tried to prove from the races, being at one, that the nations could not be at war. But I only give these vulgar and hackneyed examples in passing, as more familiar examples of fallacy. The matter at issue here is not its application, but these modern things, but rather to the most ancient things. But the more remote and unrecorded was the racial problem, the more fixed was this curious inverted certainty in the Victorian man of science. To this day, it gives man of those scientific traditions the same sort of shock to question these things, which were only the last inferences when he turned to them into the first principles. He is still more certain that he is an Aryan, even than he is an Anglo-Saxon, just as he is more certain that he is an Anglo-Saxon than he is an Irishman. He has never really discovered that he is a European, but he has never doubted that he was an Indo-European. These Victorian theories have shifted a great deal in their shape and scope, but this habit of a rapid hardening of a hypothesis into a theory, and of a theory into an assumption, has hardly yet gone out of fashion. People cannot easily get rid of the mental confusion of seeing that the foundations of history must surely be secure, that the first steps must be safe, that the biggest generalization must be obvious. But though the contradiction may seem to them a paradox, this is the very contrary of the truth. It is the large thing that is secret and invisible. It is the small thing that is evident and enormous. Every race on the face of the earth has been the subject of these speculations, and it is impossible even to suggest an outline of the subject. But if we take the European race alone, its history, or rather its prehistory, has undergone many retrospective revolutions in the short period in my own lifetime. It used to be called the Caucasian race, and I read in childhood an account of its collision with the Mongolian race. It was written by Bret Harte and opened with the query, "Or is the Caucasian played out?" Apparently the Caucasian was played out, for in a very short time he had been turned into the Indo-European man. Sometimes, I regret to say, proudly presented as the Indo-Germanic man. It seems that the Hindu and the German have similar words for mother or father, and there were other similarities between Sanskrit and various Western tongues. And with all that superficial difference between a Hindu and a German seems suddenly to disappear. Generally, this composite person was more conveniently described as an Aryan, and the really important point was that he had marched westward out of those highlands of India where fragments of his language could still be found. When I read this as a child, I had the fancy that after all the Aryan need not have marched westward and left his language behind him. He might also have marched eastward and taken his language with him. If I were to read it now, I should content myself with confessing my ignorance of the whole matter. But as a matter of fact, I have great difficulty in reading it now, because it is not being written now. It looks as if the Aryan is also played out. Anyhow, he has not merely changed his name, but changed his address, his starting place, and his route of travel. One new theory maintains that our race did not come to its present home from the east, but from the south. Some say the Europeans did not come from Asia, but from Africa. Some have even had the wild idea that Europeans came from Europe, or rather, that they never left it. Then there is a certain amount of evidence of a more or less prehistoric pressure from the north, such as that which seems to have brought the Greeks to inherit the Cretan culture, and so often brought the Gauls over the hills into the fields of Italy. But merely mention of this example of European ethnology to point out that the learned have pretty well boxed the compass by this time, and that I, who am not one of the learned, cannot pretend for a moment to decide where such doctors agree. But I can use my own common sense, and I sometimes fancy that theirs is a little rusty from want of use. The first act of common sense is to recognize the difference between a cloud and a mountain. And I will affirm that nobody knows any of these things, in the sense that we all know of the existence of the pyramids of Egypt. The truth, it may be repeated, is that what we really see, as distinct from what we may reasonably guess, is this earliest phase of history is darkness covering the earth, and great darkness the peoples, with a light or two gleaming here and there on chance patches of humanity, and that two of these flames do burn upon two of these tall primeval towns, upon the high terraces of Babylon and the huge pyramids of the Nile. They are indeed other ancient lights, or lights that may be conjectured to be very ancient, in very remote parts of that vast wilderness of night. Far away to the east there is a high civilization of vast antiquity in China. There are the remains of civilizations in Mexico and South America and other places, some of them apparently so high in civilization as to have reached the most refined forms of devil worship. But the difference lies in the element, old tradition. The tradition of these lost cultures has been broken off, and though the tradition of China still lives, it is doubtful whether we know anything about it. Moreover, a man trying to measure the Chinese antiquity has to use Chinese traditions of measurement, and he has a strange sensation of having passed into another world under other laws of time and space. Time is telescoped outward, and centuries assume the slow and stiff movement of eons. The white man, trying to see it as the yellow man sees, feels as if his head were turning round, and wonders wildly whether it is growing a pigtail. Anyhow, he cannot take in a scientific sense that queer perspective that leads up to the primeval pagoda of the first sons of heaven. He is the real antipodes, the only true alternative world to Christendom. And he is, after a fashion, walking upside down. I have spoken of the medieval map-maker and his dragon, but what medieval traveler, however much interested in monsters, would expect to find a country where a dragon is a benevolent and amiable being? Of the more serious side of Chinese tradition, something will be said in another connection, but I am only talking of tradition and the test of antiquity. And I only mention China as an antiquity that is not for us reached by a bridge old tradition, and Babylon and Egypt as antiquities that are. Herodotus is a human being, in a sense in which a Chinaman in a billycock hat, sitting opposite to us in a London tea shop, is hardly human. We feel as if we knew what David and Isaiah felt like, in a way in which we were never quite certain what Li Hung Cheng felt like. The very sins that snatched away Helen or Bathsheba have passed into a proverb of private human weakness, of pathos, and even of pardon. The very virtues of the Chinamen have about them something terrifying. This is the difference made by the destruction or preservation of a continuous historical inheritance, as from ancient Egypt to modern Europe. But when we ask what was that world that we inherit, and why those particular people and places seem to belong to it, we are led to the central fact of civilized history. That center was the Mediterranean, which was not so much a piece of water as a world, but it was a world with something of such character, such as water, for it became more and more a place of unification in which the streams of strange and very diverse cultures met. The Nile and the Tiber alike flow into the Mediterranean. So did the Egyptian and Etrurian alike contribute to a Mediterranean civilization. The glamour of the Great Sea spread indeed very far inland, and the unity was felt among the Arabs alone in the deserts and the Gauls beyond the northern hills. But the gradual building up of a common culture running around all the coasts of this inner sea is the main business of antiquity. As will be seen, it was sometimes a bad business as well as a good business. In that orbis terrarum, or circle of lands, there were the extremes of evil and of piety. There were contrasted races and still more contrasted religions. It was the scene of an endless struggle between Asia and Europe, from the night of the Persian ships at Salamis to the flight of the Turkish ships at Lepanto. It was the scene, as will be more especially suggested later, of a supreme spiritual struggle between two types of paganism, confronting each other in the Latin and the Phoenician cities, in the Roman Forum and the Punic Mart. It was the world of war and peace, the world of good and evil, the world of all that matters most. With all respect to the Aztecs and the Mongols of the Far East, they did not matter as the Mediterranean tradition mattered, and still matters. Between it and the Far East There were, of course, interesting cults and conquests of various kinds, more or less in touch with it, and in proportion as they were so intelligible also to us. The Persians came riding in to make an end of Babylon, and we are told in a Greek story how these barbarians learned to draw the bow and tell the truth. Alexander the Great, Greek, marched with his Macedonians into the sunrise and brought back strange birds colored like the sunrise clouds, and strange flowers and jewels from the gardens and treasuries of nameless kings. Islam went eastward into that world and made it partly imaginable to us, precisely because Islam itself was born in that circle of lands that fringed our own ancient and ancestral sea. In the Middle Ages, the empire of the Moguls increased its majesty without losing its mystery. The Tartars conquered China, and the Chinese apparently took very little notice of them. All of these things are interesting in themselves, but it is impossible to shift the center of gravity to the inland spaces of Asia from the inland sea of Europe. When all is said, if there were nothing in the world but that what was said and done and written and built in the lands lying around the Mediterranean, it would still be, in all the most vital and valuable things, the world in which we live. When that southern culture spread to the northwest, it produced many, very many wonderful things, of which doubtless we ourselves are the most wonderful. When it spread thence to colonies and new countries, it was still the same culture so long as it was culture at all. But round that little sea, like a lake, were the things themselves, apart from all extensions and echoes and commentaries on the things, the Republic and the Church, the Bible and the heroic epics, Islam and Israel, and the memories of lost empires, Aristotle and the measure of all things. It is because the first light upon this world is really light, the daylight in which we are still walking today, and not merely the doubtful visitation of strange stars, that I have begun here with noting where that light first falls on the towered cities of the eastern Mediterranean. But though Babylon and Egypt have thus a sort of first claim, in the very fact of being familiar and traditional, fascinating riddles to us, but also fascinating riddles to our fathers, we must not imagine that they were the only old civilizations on the southern sea, or that all the civilizations was merely Sumerian or Semitic or Coptic, still less merely Asiatic or African. Real research is more and more exalting the ancient civilization of Europe, and especially of what we may still vaguely call the Greeks. It must be understood in the sense that there were Greeks before the Greeks. As in so many of their mythology there were gods before the gods. The island of Crete was the center of the civilization now called the Minoan, after the Minos, who lingered in the ancient legend and whose labyrinth was actually discovered by modern archaeology. This elaborate European society, with its harbors and its drainage and its domestic machinery, seems to have gone down before some invasion of its northern neighbors, who made or inherited the Hellas we know in history. But that earlier period did not pass till it had given to the world gifts so great that the world has ever since been striving in vain to repay them, if only by plagiarism. Somewhere along the Ionian coast, opposite Crete and the islands, was a town of some sort, probably of the sort that we should call a village or hamlet, with a wall. It was called Ilion, but it came to be called Troy, and the name will never perish from the earth. A poet who may have been a beggar and a ballad monger, who may have been unable to read or write, and was described by tradition as a blind, composed a poem about the Greeks going to war with this town to recover the most beautiful woman in the world. That the most beautiful woman in the world lived in that one little town sounds like a legend. That the most beautiful poem in the world was written by somebody who knew of nothing larger than such little towns is a historical fact. It is thought that the poem came at the end of the period, and that the primitive culture brought it forth in its decay, in which case one would like to have seen that culture in its prime. But anyhow, it is true that this, which is our first poem, might very well be our last poem, too. It might well be the last word as well as the first word spoken by a man about his mortal lot, as seen by mere mortal vision. If the world becomes pagan and perishes, the last man alive would do well to quote the Iliad and die. But in this one great human revelation of antiquity, there is another element of great historical importance, which has hardly, I think, been given its proper place in history. The poet has so conceived the poem that his sympathies apparently, and those of his readers certainly, are on the side of the vanquished rather than the victor. And this is a sentiment which increases in the poetical tradition, even as the poetical origin itself recedes. Achilles had some status as a sort of demigod in pagan times. But Hector grows greater as the ages pass, and it is his name that is the name of a knight of the Round Table, and his sword that legend puts in the hand of Roland, laying about him with the weapon of the defeated Hector in the last ruin and splendor of his own defeat. The name anticipates all the defeats through which our race and religion were to pass, that survival of 100 defeats that is its triumph. The tale of the end of Troy shall have no ending, for it is lifted up forever into living echoes, immortal as our hopelessness and our hope. Troy standing as a small thing that may have stood nameless for ages, but Troy falling has been caught up in a flame and suspended from an immortal instant of annihilation, and because it was destroyed with fire, the fire shall never be destroyed. And as the city, so with the hero, traced in archaic lines, in that primeval twilight is found the first figure of the knight. There is a prophetic confidence in this title. We have spoken of the word chivalry and how it seems to mingle the horseman with the horse. Its most anticipated ages before in the thunder of the Homeric hexameter, and that long leaping word with which the Iliad ends. It is that very unity for which we can find no name but the holy centaur of chivalry. But there are other reasons for giving in this glimpse of antiquity the name upon the sacred town. The sanctity of such towns ran like a fire around the coasts and islands of the northern Mediterranean, the high fenced hamlet for which heroes died. From the smallness of the city came the greatness of the citizen. Hellas, with her 100 statues, produced nothing statelier than that walking statue, the idea of the self-commanding man. Hellas of the 100 statues was one legend in literature, and all that labyrinth of little walled nations resounding with the lament of Troy. A later legend, an afterthought but not an accident, said that stragglers from Troy founded a republic on the Italian shore. It was true in spirit that republican virtue had such a root, a mystery of honor that was not born of Babylon or the Egyptian pride. There shone like the shield of Hector, defying Asia and Africa, till the light of a new day was loosened, with the rushing of the eagles and the coming of the name that came like a thunderclap when the world woke to Rome. Part 1, Chapter 4, God and Comparative Religion. I was once escorted over the Roman foundations of an ancient British city by a professor, who said something that seemed to me a satire on a good many other professors. Possibly the professor saw the joke, though he maintained an iron gravity, and may or may not have realized that it was a joke against a great deal of what is called comparative religion. I pointed out a sculpture of the head of the sun, with the usual halo of rays, but with the difference that the face in the disk, instead of being boyish like Apollo, was bearded like Neptune or Jupiter. Yes, he said with a certain delicate exactitude, that is supposed to represent the local god Sol. The best authorities identify Sol with Minerva, but this has been held to show that the identification is not complete. That is what we call a powerful understatement. The modern world is manner than any satires on it. Long ago Mr. Belloc made his burlesque Dawn say that a bust of Ariadne had been proved by modern research to be Silenus, but that is not better than the real appearance of Minerva as the bearded woman of Mr. Barnum. Only both of them are very like many identifications by the best authorities on comparative religion. And when Catholic creeds are identified with various wild myths, I do not laugh or curse or misbehave myself. I confine myself decorously to saying that the identification is not complete. In the days of my youth, the religion of humanity was a term commonly applied to Comtism, the theory of certain rationalists who worshipped corporate mankind as a supreme being. Even in the days of my youth, I remarked that there was something slightly odd about despising and dismissing the doctrine of the Trinity as a mystical and even maniacal contradiction, and then asking us to adore a deity who is 100 million persons in one God, neither confounding the persons nor dividing the substance. But there is another entity, more or less definable and much more imaginable than the many-headed and monstrous idol of mankind. And it has a much better light to be called, in a reasonable sense, the religion of humanity. Man is indeed not an idol, but man is almost everywhere the idolater. And these multitudinous idolatries of man have had something about them in many ways more human and sympathetic than a modern metaphysical abstraction. If an Asiatic god had 3 heads and 7 arms, there is, at least in it, the idea of material incarnation bringing an unknown power nearer to us and not farther away. But if our friends Brown, Jones, and Robinson, when out for a Sunday walk, were transformed and amalgamated into an Asiatic idol before our eyes, they would surely seem farther away. If the arms of Brown and the legs of Robinson waved from the same composite body, there would seem to be waving something of a sad farewell. If the heads of all 3 gentlemen appeared smiling on the same neck, we should hesitate even by what name to address our new and somewhat abnormal friend. In the many-headed and many-handed Oriental idol, there is a certain sense of mysteries becoming, at least partly, intelligible, of formless forces of nature taking some dark but material form. But though this may be true of the multiform God, it is not so of the multiform man. The human beings become less human by becoming less separate. We might say less human in being less lonely. The human beings become less intelligible as they become less isolated. We might say with a strict truth that the closer they are to us, the farther they are away. An ethical hymn book of this humanitarian sort of religion was carefully selected and expurgated on the principle of preserving anything human and eliminating anything divine. One consequence was that a myth appeared in the amended form of "Nearer mankind to thee, nearer to thee." It always suggested to me the sensations of a strap hanger during the crush on the tube. But it is strange and wonderful how far away the souls of men can seem when their bodies are so near as all that. The human unity with which I deal here is not to be confounded with this modern industrial monotony and herding, which is rather a congestion than a communion. It is a thing to which human groups left themselves, and even human individuals left to themselves, have everywhere tended by an instinct that may be truly called human. Like all healthy human beings, it has varied very much within the limits of a general character. For that is characteristic of everything belonging to that ancient land of liberty that lies before and around the servile industrial town. Industrialism actually boasts that its products are all of one pattern, that men in Jamaica or Japan can break the same seal and drink the same bad whiskey, that a man at the North Pole and another at the South might recognize the same optimistic level of the same dubious tinned salmon. But wine, the gift of gods to men, can vary with every valley and every vineyard, can turn into 100 wines without any wine once reminding us of whiskey, and cheeses can change from county to county without forgetting the difference between chalk and cheese. When I am speaking of this thing, therefore, I am speaking of something that doubtless includes very wide differences. Nevertheless, I will here maintain that it is one thing. I will maintain that most of the modern botheration comes from not realizing that it is really one thing. I will advance the thesis that before all talk about comparative religion and the separate religious founders of the world, the first essential is to recognize this thing as a whole, as a thing most native and most normal to the great fellowship that we call mankind. This thing is paganism, and I propose to show in these pages that it is one real rival to the Church of Christ. Comparative religion is very comparative indeed. That is, it is so much a matter of degree and distance and difference that it is only comparatively successful when it tries to compare. When we come to look at it closely, we find it comparing things that are really quite incomparable. We are accustomed to see a table or a catalogue of the world's great religions in parallel columns, until we fancy they are really parallel. We are accustomed to see the names of the great religious founders all in a row: Christ, Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius. But in truth this is only a trick, because another of these optical illusions by which any objects may be put into a particular relation by shifting to a particular point of sight. Those religions and religious founders, or rather those whom we choose to lump together as religions and religious founders, do not really show any common character. The illusion is partly produced by Islam coming immediately after Christianity in the list, as Islam did come after Christianity and was largely an imitation of Christianity. But the other Eastern religions, or what we call religions, not only do not resemble the Church, but do not resemble each other. When we come to Confucianism at the end of the list, we come to something in a totally different world of thought. To compare the Christian and Confucian religions is like comparing a theist with an English squire, or asking whether a man is a believer in immortality or 100% American. Confucianism may be a civilization, but it is not a religion. In truth, the Church is too unique to prove herself unique. For most popular and easy proof is by parallel, and there is no parallel. It is not easy, therefore, to expose the fallacy by which a false classification is created to swamp a unique thing, when it really is a unique thing. As there is nowhere else exactly the same fact, so there is nowhere else exactly the same fallacy. But I will take the nearest thing I can find to such a solitary social phenomenon in order to show how it was thus swamped and assimilated. I imagine most of us would agree that there is something unusual and unique about the position of the Jews. There is nothing that is quite in the same sense an international nation, an ancient culture scattered in different countries, but still distinct and indestructible. Now this business is like an attempt to make a list of nomadic nations in order to soften the strange solitude of the Jew. It would be easy enough to do it, by the same process of putting a plausible approximation first, then tailing off into totally different things thrown in somehow to make up the list. Thus, in the new list of nomadic nations, the Jews would be followed by the Gypsies, who at least are really nomadic if they are not really national. Then the professor of the new science of comparative nomadics would pass easily on to something different, even if it was very different. He would remark on the wandering adventure of the English who had scattered their colonies so over so many seas, and call them nomads. It is quite true that a great many Englishmen seem to be strangely restless in England. It is quite true that not all of them have left their country for the country's good. The moment we mention the wandering empire of the English, we must add the strange exiled empire of the Irish. For it is a curious fact, to be noted in our imperial literature, that the same ubiquity and unrest which is a proof of English enterprise and a triumph is a proof of Irish futility and failure. Then the professor of nomadism would look around thoughtfully and remember that there was a great talk recently of German waiters, German barbers, German clerks, Germans naturalizing themselves in England and the United States and the South American republics. The Germans would go down as the fifth nomadic race. The words wanderlust and folk wandering would come in very useful here. For there really have been historians who explained the Crusades by suggesting that the Germans were found wandering, as police say, in what happened to be the neighborhood of Palestine. Then the professor, feeling he was now near the end, would make a last leap in desperation. He would recall the fact that the French army has captured nearly every capital in Europe, and that it marched across countless conquered lands under Charlemagne or Napoleon, and that would be wanderlust, and that would be the note of a nomadic race. Thus he would have his 6 nomadic nations all compact and complete, and would feel that the Jew was no longer a sort of mysterious and even mystical exception. But people with more common sense would probably realize that he had only extended nomadism by extending the meaning of nomadism, and that he had extended that until it really had no meaning at all. It is quite true that the French soldier has made some of the finest marches in all military history. But it is equally true, and far more self-evident, that if the French peasant is not a rooted reality, then there is no such thing as a rooted reality in the world. Or, in other words, if he is a nomad, there is nobody who is not a nomad. Now that is the sort of trick that has been tried in the case of comparative religion, and the world's religious founders all standing respectably in a row. It seeks to classify Jesus as the other would classify Jews, by inventing a new class for the purpose and filling up the rest of it with stopgaps and second-rate copies. I do not mean that these other things are not often great things in their own real character and class. Confucianism and Buddhism are great things, but it is not true to call them churches. Just as the French and English are great peoples, but it is nonsense to call them nomads. There are some points of resemblance between Christendom and the imitation in Islam. For that matter, there are some points of resemblance between Jews and Gypsies. But after that, the lists are made up of anything that comes to hand, of anything that can be put in the same catalog without being in the same category. In this sketch of religious history, with all decent deference to men much more learned than myself, I propose to cut across and disregard this modern method of classification, which I feel sure has falsified the facts of history. I shall here submit an alternative classification of religions, or religion, which I believe will be found to cover all facts, and, what is quite as important here, all the fancies. Instead of dividing religion geographically, as it were vertically, into Christian, Muslim, Brahmin, Buddhist, and so on, I would divide it psychologically, and in some sense horizontally, into the strata of spiritual elements and influences that could sometimes exist in the same country, or even in the same man. Putting the church apart for the moment, I would be disposed to divide the natural religion of the mass of mankind under such headings as these: gods, the demons, the philosophers. I believe some such classification will help us sort out the spiritual experiences of men much more successfully than the conventional business of comparing religions, and that many famous figures will naturally fall into their place in this way who were only forced into their place in the other. As I shall make use of these titles or terms more than once in narrative and allusion, it will be done to define at this stage for what I mean them to stand, and I will begin with the first, the simplest, and the most sublime in this chapter. In considering the elements of pagan humanity, we must begin by an attempt to describe the indescribable. Many get over the difficulty of describing it by the expedient of denying it, or at least ignoring it. But the whole point of it is that it was something that was never quite eliminated even when it was ignored. They are obsessed by their evolutionary monomania that every great thing grows from a seed, or something smaller than itself. They seem to forget that every seed comes from a tree, or something larger than itself. Now there is a very good ground for guessing that religion did not originally come from some detail that was forgotten, because it was too small to be traced. Much more probably it was an idea that was abandoned because it was too large to be managed. There is a very good reason to suppose that many people did begin with the simple but overwhelming idea of one God who governs all, and afterwards fell away into such things as demon worship, almost as a sort of secret dissipation. Even the test of savage beliefs, of which the folklore students are so fond, is admittedly often found in support of such view. Some of the very rudest savages, primitive in every sense in which the anthropologists use the word, the Australian Aborigines, for instance, are found to have a pure monotheism with a high moral tone. A missionary was preaching to a very wild tribe of polytheists, and had told them all their polytheistic tales, and telling them in return of the existence of the one good God who is but a spirit and judges men by spiritual standards. And there was a general buzz of excitement among these stolid barbarians, as at somebody who was letting out a secret. And they cried out to each other, "Atahokan, he is speaking of Atahokan." Probably it was a point of politeness and even decency among those polytheists not to speak of Atahokan. The name is not perhaps so much adapted as some of our own to direct and solemn religious exhortation, but many other social forces are always covering up and confusing such simple ideas. Possibly the old God stood for an old morality found irksome in more expansive moments. Possibly intercourse with demons was a more fashionable among the best people, as in the modern fashion of spiritualism. Anyhow, there were any number of similar examples. They all testify to the unmistakable psychology of a thing taken for granted, as distinct from a thing talked about. There is a striking example in a tale taken down word for word from a Red Indian in California, which starts out with a hearty legendary and literary relish. The sun is the father and the ruler of the heavens. He is the big chief. The moon is his wife and the stars are his children, and so on through a most ingenious and complicated story, in the middle of which is a sudden parenthesis saying that the sun and the moon have to do something because it is ordered that way by the Great Spirit who lives above the place of all. That is exactly the attitude of most paganism toward God. He is something assumed and forgotten and remembered by accident, a habit possibly not peculiar to pagans. Sometimes the higher deity is remembered in the high moral grades and is a sort of mystery. But always, it is truly said, the savage is talkative about his mythology and taciturn about his religion. The Australian savages, indeed, exhibit a topsy-turvydom, such as the ancients might have found truly worthy of the antipodes. The savage who thinks nothing of tossing off such a trifle as the tale of the sun and moon being the halves of a baby chopped in two, or dropped into small talk about a colossal cosmic cow milked to make the rain, merely in order to be sociable, will then retire to a secret cavern sealed against women and white men, temples of terrible initiation, where to the thunder of the bull-roarer and the dripping of sacrificial blood, the priest whispers the final secrets known only to the initiate, that honesty is the best policy, that a little kindness does nobody any harm, that all men are brothers, and that there is but one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible. In other words, we have here the curiosity of religious history that the savage seems to be parading all the more repulsive and impossible parts of his belief, and concealing all the most sensible and credible parts. But the explanation is that they are not in that sense parts of his belief, or at least not parts of the sort of belief. The myths are merely tall stories, though as tall as the sky, the water spout, or the tropic rain. The mysteries are true stories and are taken secretly that they may be taken seriously. Indeed, it is only too easy to forget that there is a thrill in theism. A novel in which a number of separate characters all turned out to be the same character would certainly be a sensational novel. It is so with the idea that sun and tree and river are the disguises of one God and not of many. Alas, we also find it only too easy to take a Tahoe-Khan for granted. But whether he is allowed to fade into a truism or preserved as a sensation by being preserved as a secret, it is clear that he is always either an old truism or an old tradition. There is nothing to show that he is an improved product of the mere mythology, and everything to show that he preceded it. He is worshipped by the simplest tribes, with no trace of ghosts or grave offerings, or any of the complications in which Herbert Spencer and Grant Allen sought the origin of the simplest of all ideas. Whatever else there was never such a thing as the evolution of the idea of God. The idea was concealed, was avoided, was almost forgotten, and was even explained away, but it has never evolved.